You know, there's a thought leader in the conservative movement by the name of David French. I'm sure you've heard of him. You probably, if you're like me, used to read his work all the time. And the reason that I'm bringing him up today is because I find it personally almost devastating, disappointing, verging on devastating, right along that spectrum of emotion, to watch what has happened to David French today. I used to respect David French's work so much. He was one of the first conservatives, he's a lawyer, he was one of the first conservatives who would actually use the power of the law to protect the free speech rights of conservatives on college campuses. I'm talking like a decade and a half ago, back when the censorship or the cancellation of conservatives on college campuses became prominent. Those were the stories we'd hear reported, that a conservative was downgraded because of their conservative views, or they weren't allowed to table because they were pro-life unless they were in a designated free speech zone. And David French came in and he used the power of the law to defend the free speech of these people. And I had so much respect for him. And then something happened to David French. And I don't know what that thing that happened to David French is, but he turned his back on the conservative movement. He became, maybe the thing that happened was Donald Trump. But when I say the thing that happened that was Donald Trump, I don't blame Trump. I'm just saying that was the turning point in David French's career. And he is now so never Trump, so against the so-called MAGA movement, that he wrote an article in the New York Times, where he works now, entitled, "To Save Conservatism from Itself, I Am Voting for Harris." And when I first saw that, I actually thought it was a parody. I saw a screenshot of this on X 2 or 3 days ago, and I thought, surely not. Surely he would not write an article with that title. Surely this is a joke. Surely this must be the Babylon Bee, perhaps? No. This is a real article. And if it sounds like an insane headline, it's because it is. It would be like saying, to save the baby, I'm aborting her. To save the Second Amendment, I'm going to confiscate your guns. To save kids from transgender ideology, I'm going to trans that kid. To save free speech, I'm going to censor you. To save your job, I'm going to fire you. To save the American Republic form of government, of the people, by the people, for the people, I'm going to vote for a Marxist. I want to read a little bit of this because, like it or not, David French, because of his legacy in the conservative movement, has some influence left, particularly in certain circles of conservatism, and he's completely wrong. It's not just something to be mocked, although this is easy to be mocked, but it's something important to debunk. These are his reasons for voting for Kamala Harris. He says, I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris in 2024, and ironically enough, I'm doing it in part to try to save conservatism. Here's what I mean, he writes. Since the day Donald Trump came down that escalator in 2015, the MAGA movement has been engaged in a long-running, slow-rolling, ideological, and characterological transformation of the Republican Party. Let's just pause there for a second. I don't know why that's an indictment against Donald Trump. The previous control of the Republican Party were libertarians and swamp creatures, the Uniparty, the George Bushes, who are just about indistinguishable from the left, people who start forever wars, who spend us into oblivion. This is not a bad thing to have a check on the Republican Party and say, well, wait a second, you are betraying the values of the Republican Party. You're turning it into something bad. It's time for a renewal. Well, apparently to David French, it is not time for a renewal. He says at each step, it has pushed Republicans further and further away from Reaganite conservatism. Pause there again. This is perhaps one of my most unpopular opinions. I think Reagan was a great president, obviously. I think what Reagan did to end the Cold War, to defeat communism, the spread of communism, is unparalleled in world history. But there were also some domestic policies of Ronald Reagan that are still wreaking absolutely dreadful havoc in our country today. For example, Reagan was the one who shielded vaccine manufacturers from liability. The vaccine manufacturers came to Ronald Reagan and they blackmailed him. They said, if you don't stop people from suing us because our vaccines are hurting them and the people are suing us after they've been harmed, we're not going to make these vaccines anymore. And so what did Ronald Reagan do? He passed a law that took liability away from vaccine manufacturers, and now the US government pays out people who have been harmed from vaccines. But what's the implication of this? The implication of this is that vaccine manufacturers have absolutely zero incentive to have their products be safe. Zero incentive, because they're never held accountable. They're never responsible in any way for the damage inflicted by their own product. Ronald Reagan fell for that. And that has implications today, serious implications. He also ushered in no-fault divorce. He was the first governor in the United States to allow no-fault divorce in the state of California, probably because of his own history with divorce. And I say this not to trash Ronald Reagan, but just because people like David French don't actually analyze the Republican Party, especially historically, or Republican politicians through a fair lens. They don't objectively analyze the legacy of certain Republicans or certain brands of Republicanism. They just say, Ronald Reagan, let us hold Ronald Reagan up onto a pedestal. Well, no, you can admire what he did on communism, but you also have to acknowledge that objectively, he also caused some damage domestically, some pretty serious damage that we are still suffering the repercussions of to this day. But he wants to take us back to that. David French does. He says the MAGA movement, or Donald Trump, has divorced Republican voters from any major consideration of character and leadership, and all the while it has labeled people who resisted that change as traitors. This is ironic to me because if you look at President Trump's life, sure, you can objectively analyze it and say, oh, wow, he's been married 3 times. That's not typically what Republican voters advocate for when it comes to family. And you can acknowledge that divorce destabilizes families. You know, broken families are the root of a lot of problems in our society. At the same time, that isn't the current Donald Trump. That's Donald Trump's past. The current Donald Trump actually has a tremendous amount of stability. He's been married to Melania for I don't know how many years, decades. His children and his children's children, his grandchildren, adore him, respect him. He's present in all of their lives. And in fact, his life right now is an example of family stability. And it's funny that people like David French, who act like Donald Trump's divorces should be somehow kind of a disqualifier for office, ignore the fact that Ronald Reagan was also divorced. And not only was he divorced, he used his own personal experience in divorcing his first wife, or in his first wife divorcing him, to motivate a policy that's been incredibly destructive for the United States of America. Just a note. David French goes on to say, let's take another assertion that should be relatively uncontroversial. Political violence and threats of violence have no place in American democratic process. It's actually not entirely true, right? Wasn't our country founded on political violence? I'm not advocating for political violence. In our current situation, I generally think it's wrong, but it's one of my pet peeves when people say, political violence has no place in America. Like, we were founded on political violence. He goes, yet threats and intimidation follow the MAGA movement like night follows day. One of the saddest stories of our time is the way in which even local election officials and local school board members fear for their safety. The level of threat against public officials has escalated in the MAGA era. It's obviously wrong if anybody is threatening a local school board member, but let's remember what David French does not note here, that these local school board members are advocating for, grooming children into, and inflicting actual harm on children in the name of gender ideology and critical race theory. They are also rejecting the objective reality that parents have dominion over their children and not some school board member. So not justifying threats against school board members, but lacking a little context there, Mr. French. He said in the MAGA era, MAGA Republicans often wield threats as a weapon against Republican dissenters. What? That's not frequent at all. I can't even think of one example of that. And every American should remember January 6th when a mob of insurrectionists ransacked the Capitol. Oh, he buys into the left's lies about January 6th. He thinks Donald Trump is an insurrectionist because Donald Trump told people who were committing vandalism and going into going into prohibited areas that wasn't really clear that it was prohibited because you had people moving the barriers, people who were connected to feds moving the barriers. He's calling those people insurrectionists, even though Donald Trump told them to protest peacefully and powerfully, and when there was vandalism being committed, he told them to go home. If there are any Republicans who still buy into the left's narrative on January 6th, I think we can dismiss them and dismiss their opinions. And I don't say this, you could, on January 6th of 2021, before we knew the facts on the ground, before the reporting came out about the feds infiltrating and encouraging and essentially entrapping people, before any of that came out, I don't blame you for looking at the way the media was portraying January 6th and thinking, oh, that doesn't look good. Because there were people doing things that they should not have been doing. That's unequivocally true. No one, I think, argues otherwise. What we argue against is the weaponization of the federal government against people who, at most, committed vandalism, walked inside a secure fence or inside an open door that was opened by police, and then have terrorism charges added to their to the indictment against them. That's David French doesn't mention any of that. He doesn't mention the righteous indignation that Americans felt after the 2020 election was electioneered. There is simply no argument that rules around elections, laws around voting were changed by people who had no authority to make those changes. Look at Wisconsin, for example. There is no authority for these election officials to put unmanned drop boxes in cities across Wisconsin. It was against the law. But because they changed that law without authority, it allowed the left to play a different ground game to recruit voters. And the voters themselves might have not been committing open voter fraud. They didn't know they were. But the rules had been changed, which means those votes were invalid. David French doesn't mention any of this. He said, only one party has nominated a man who was indicted for his role in the criminal scheme to steal an American election. Oh, was Donald Trump the one that changed those rules? No, he was not. He was looking for a constitutional remedy against the electioneering. And he didn't find one. Because the courts were unwilling to listen. The media propagandized. I don't want to digress into January 6th and the 2020 election. We have plenty of time for that. But the lack of context that David French is adding to this article is at the level of, the New York Times, where he works. He said, it is fascinating to me, this is French, that there are voices online who still claim that a person can't be Christian and vote for Democrats, when the Trump campaign watered down the Republican platform on abortion to such an extent that it's functionally pro-choice. This is actually a very interesting conversation to be had. And I know abortion is not a popular topic to talk about, but this is interesting because Donald Trump was the most pro-life president of our lifetime, hands down. Donald Trump appointed the Supreme Court justices that overturned Roe v. Wade, something no Republican had been able to do since Roe v. Wade. Donald Trump faced down the media, the voracious pack of wolves in the media that tried to falsely accuse Brett Kavanaugh of sexual violence because they were so opposed to a constitutional scholar sitting on the bench of the Supreme Court. Donald Trump had the courage to appoint Amy Coney Barrett after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, even though the left told him he was breaking norms by nominating a new justice during that particular period of time. Donald Trump was the most pro-life president of our time. And I don't agree either, by the way, with Donald Trump watering down the RNC platform on abortion. But I also understand that actions speak louder than words. Donald Trump's actions have been very pro-life. And the reason that they watered down the language, I'm not excusing it, I'm not justifying it, I'm just explaining why they did it. The reason they watered it down is because Republicans in general have failed so abysmally in fighting back against the left's lies when it comes to abortion. They categorize it as miscarriage care, as ectopic pregnancy care. They always tell these truly heartbreaking stories and act like the solution to those stories is abortion. And Republicans are too afraid of offending women to actually describe what an abortion is and to state unequivocal opposition to it. And so we've lost the culture war to a certain extent on abortion. And what Donald Trump is doing right now is trying to win this election. And I don't agree with the consultants that told him that the way to do that is not to offend women who are pro-abortion. That's not going to work, obviously. But that's the reason he did that. It's not because he had an ideological change of mind on abortion. And David French knows this. He writes, in many ways, the most concretely conservative action I can take, this is French writing, in this election is to vote for a candidate who will stand against Vladimir Putin. By voting for pro-life politicians down ballot, I can help prevent federal liberalization of abortion law. But if a president decides to abandon Ukraine and cripple NATO, there's little anyone can do. What? What? Is there actually anyone left who thinks that Zelensky is an honest character? The day Donald Trump takes office, he will put an end to the war in Ukraine. Do you think that Vladimir Putin would have invaded Ukraine if Donald Trump was president? The answer to that question is, of course not. Right now, what's happening is David French is on the side of the globalists who are devaluing the US dollar. It's, in fact, there's a threat of the US dollar being rejected and abandoned as the world reserve currency because Biden is overspending, giving our money to Ukraine to the point that it's devalued the US dollar. If you support that, you are bananas. Bananas. French goes, I loathe sex abuse, pornography, and adultery. Trump has brought these vices into the mainstream of the Republican Party. Trump did not bring sex abuse, pornography, and adultery into the Republican Party. What are you talking about? This was the sexual revolution, which was allowed by libertarians. Libertarians in the Republican Party allowed immorality to be ingrained in our country, immorality that came at the behest of the Marxists. And he goes, America became more brutal and violent during Trump's term. And who was that was committing brutality and violence? Did you want to talk about the BLM riots? Did you want to talk about the Women's March? Did you want to talk about the anti-Semitic hordes on college campuses that are sympathetic to Hamas, who committed a brutal act of terror against innocent Israelis? Did you want to talk about the crime being committed by illegal aliens who have come across the border illegally thanks to Biden's open borders policy? Did you want to mention that this violence is being committed by leftists who think that people on the right deserve to be silenced and canceled and brutalized? Or did you just want to pretend that this is Trump's fault? Because a vote for Harris is a vote for all of those things. A vote for Harris is a vote for abortion. A vote for Harris is a vote for open borders. A vote for Harris is a vote to weaken the U.S. standing in the world by devaluing our currency, giving it to a crook in Ukraine. I don't know what David French's problem is. I don't know why he flipped. I don't know what happened to his mind. I don't know what happened to his politics. But there is absolutely no excuse on planet Earth for a conservative to vote for Kamala Harris.